Welcome to Sleepy Centuries, and tonight we'll be drifting through time and stars as we explore the complete history of the space race. From the first ideas of rocketry to the quiet cooperation of today's space agencies, this story is a slow journey through ambition, rivalry, wonder, and peace. So take a deep breath, close your eyes, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Somewhere warm and quiet, or cool and breezy? Wherever you are, let's begin our journey to the stars, together. Imagine looking up at the night sky thousands of years ago. There are no planes above you, no satellites, no blinking lights, no cities to wash out the stars, just a velvet black dome scattered with thousands upon thousands of distant fires. To ancient eyes, the sky was alive. It moved, it changed, it told stories. The moon waxed and waned with time, tides, and mystery. Planets wandered across the heavens like gods. Comets arrived like omens, unpredictable and burning, and always, high above, unreachable, the stars silently watched. But still, even then, the question lingered, what if we could go there? Long before rockets, before science, before the idea of engines and fuel, the dream of reaching the skies had already taken root in the human spirit. In ancient mythologies from all corners of the world, people imagined flight not in machines, but on wings of magic and hope. The Greeks told of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun. In India's ancient texts, flying chariots called Vimanas crossed the heavens. In China, tales of immortals riding dragons through the clouds filled scrolls and song. Even in medieval Europe, thinkers speculated about crystal spheres, carrying celestial bodies, orbiting in divine harmony. These weren't scientific theories, yet they were longings. Longings wrapped in poetry and wonder. Then, in the 13th century, something changed. In China, alchemists experimenting with black powder, a mixture of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, stumbled upon something powerful: fireworks. Explosive, dazzling, and magical. But more than just celebration, fireworks held a secret. They moved, they launched, they rose. Simple tubes filled with powder became the world's first rockets. These early fire arrows were crude and short-ranged, often used in warfare, attached to arrows or bamboo sticks. But they were also the first machines that showed it was possible to push something upward with fire. The dream had taken its first trembling step away from legend and toward reality. Centuries passed. Curiosity deepened. In the 17th century, Isaac Newton's laws of motion began to explain not only how objects moved on Earth, but how they might move beyond it. He imagined, in a thought experiment, a cannon that fired a ball so fast it would never fall back to Earth, an early picture of orbit. Still, there were no engines yet that could do such a thing. But the idea was planted, and ideas, once planted, grow. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a quiet revolution began, not with governments or armies, but with individuals, men working in solitude, often misunderstood or ignored. In Russia, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, a schoolteacher with a deep love of science fiction, began to publish detailed visions of spaceflight. He calculated how rockets could work in the vacuum of space, long before most people even believed space was real. He suggested using liquid fuel, long metal stages, and pressurized cabins for astronauts. To his neighbors, he seemed eccentric, just another dreamer. But his writings would go on to inspire generations of engineers and visionaries. Thousands of miles away in the United States, another solitary thinker was making metal speak. Robert Goddard, a shy and meticulous physicist, was fascinated by propulsion. While others laughed at the idea of reaching space, Goddard quietly built, tested, and documented. In 1926, on a snowy field in Massachusetts, he launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It rose only 41 feet, stayed aloft for just 2.5 seconds, and landed in a cabbage field. But it worked. Something he had designed and built had lifted itself with fire and fuel, unchained from the earth. He barely made headlines, but history remembers. That short hop was the ancestor of every rocket that followed. Others soon joined this strange pursuit. In Germany, engineers began studying rocketry in greater detail, initially as peaceful exploration. But with the rise of political tensions, their work would take a darker path. Still, even in these early decades, the pattern was clear. This wasn't just about flying, it was about escaping, reaching, pushing beyond, always upward, always farther. As the 20th century matured, the pieces were assembling: better fuels, clearer physics, materials strong enough to withstand the stress of launch. Slowly, the question shifted from, is it possible, to when will it happen? The sky was no longer a ceiling, it was a destination. And somewhere, maybe tonight, under the same stars those ancient sky watchers once studied, that old dream still whispers, softly, urgently, what if we could go there? What if we already have? The dream of reaching space, of exploring the stars, was born in wonder, but its early steps were shaped in shadows. The Second World War had drawn much of the world into chaos, and in the heart of Europe, far from the silent beauty of the night sky, rockets were being built not for exploration, but for war. It was in Germany, under the tightening grip of the Nazi regime, that rocketry took a dark leap forward. Wernher von Braun, a brilliant young engineer with a passion for spaceflight, found himself leading the development of the V2 rocket, short for Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. It was a missile unlike anything the world had ever seen. Fueled by ethanol and liquid oxygen, powered by a roaring engine, and guided by gyroscopes, it could travel over 180 miles and reach supersonic speeds. When launched, it soared higher than the speed of sound, and by the time its shriek was heard, it had already landed, destroying buildings, ending lives, and spreading fear. To the German military, the V2 was a technological marvel and a tool of terror, but to a few of its creators, like von Braun, it was also something else: proof of concept, a stepping stone, a machine that showed, however tragically, that it was possible to reach beyond the limits of the Earth. But it came at a terrible cost. The V2s were built in underground factories by prisoners, forced laborers, who suffered and died under inhumane conditions. For every technical achievement, there was human pain. The legacy of these rockets would always carry that weight. When the war ended in 1945, the race for space became a race for knowledge and power between two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations understood that the rocket technology developed in Germany could be the key not just to future wars, but to something more profound: control of the skies, control of orbit, and perhaps, one day, control of the moon. Operation Paperclip was launched by the Americans to secretly bring German scientists to the US, including von Braun and hundreds of his team members. They were settled in places like White Sands, New Mexico, and Huntsville, Alabama, where they began working on missile systems for the US Army. At the same time, the Soviets were conducting their own operations, capturing V2 hardware and recruiting German engineers to work under Soviet supervision. Both sides were quietly assembling the minds and machines that would fuel the next great competition. Not one fought with tanks, but with thrust, orbit, and vacuum. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the development of rockets continued, largely in secret. The focus was military ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads across continents. But as these machines became more powerful, their potential for peaceful exploration became harder to ignore. Every improvement in range and payload brought humanity a step closer to orbit. And behind the closed doors of research facilities, the dream of spaceflight once carried in myths and novel soirs, being written into equations and blueprints. In America, von Braun continued to balance two lives. Publicly, he worked on military rocketry. Privately, he never stopped imagining space. He wrote articles about future missions to the Moon and Mars. He sketched space stations, circular and bright, hanging above the Earth like lanterns. In the Soviet Union, a man named Sergei Korolev, known only by the title chief designer, was doing the same. A former prisoner of Stalin's purges, Korolev was a visionary, obsessed with rocketry and driven by quiet determination. Under his guidance, the Soviets developed a powerful new booster, the R-7. Originally designed to carry nuclear weapons, the R-7 had the strength to lift a payload into orbit. It was, without question, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, but hidden inside it was the beginning of space travel. The world didn't yet know the names of these men. They worked behind layers of secrecy, pushing the limits of engineering in the midst of global suspicion. But the moment was coming when everything would change, when the sky would no longer be empty, when a machine, born of wartime invention, would become a symbol of peaceful discovery. The tools of destruction were about to become instruments of awe. So much of space history is remembered through milestones: first launches, first landings, first footsteps. But the foundation was built in laboratories and bunkers, drawn on chalkboards and etched into metal. It was built by people who carried complex legacies, some dreamers, some soldiers, some both. And though the world would celebrate the beauty of spaceflight, the truth is that its earliest roots were tangled in a time of fear, control, and conflict. Still, even in that darkness, a light was growing, because every calculation, every test, every rocket that roared into the sky carried with it something more than politics or power. It carried the ancient human question, what lies beyond? The war had ended, but a new kind of race had begun, not with armies, but with orbits, not with borders, but with altitudes. And somewhere, deep in the silence above the clouds, space waited, watching, ready. In the early morning hours of October 5th, 1957, radios across the world crackled with an eerie, rhythmic beeping. It was a sound unlike any other, steady, mechanical, and impossibly distant. Those pulses weren't coming from any station on Earth. They were coming from space. Just a few hours earlier, the Soviet Union had done what no nation had done before. They had launched an object, built by human hands, into orbit around the planet. Its name was Sputnik. Just 23 inches wide and weighing a mere 184 pounds, this polished metal sphere with 4 thin antennae marked the beginning of a new era. The space age had arrived, and with it, a shift so profound that the world would never again see the sky the same way. To the Soviet engineers and scientists who had labored in secrecy for years, Sputnik was a triumphant symbol of technological mastery and national pride. But to the rest of the world, especially the United States, it was a wake-up call. For the first time, the vast silence above the clouds was broken not by the winds of nature, but by a man-made voice. The simple beeping from orbit became the loudest sound in global politics. In schools, children looked up in wonder, in worry. Newspapers shouted headlines of Soviet superiority. Military officials scrambled to understand the implications. If the Soviets could place a satellite in orbit, could they also drop weapons from space? Could they strike anywhere on Earth from above? Beneath the awe was a growing sense of vulnerability, and with it, urgency. But beyond the geopolitics, Sputnik stirred something older, deeper, something human. The idea that something built by us, by people, was now flying above Earth on its own, endlessly circling, unbound by gravity, was profoundly moving. For centuries, the heavens had belonged only to nature and myth. Now, for the first time, something artificial had joined the stars. And it wasn't just the fact that Sputnik was in space, it was the way it connected people across the globe. Its signal could be picked up by amateur radio operators and backyard tinkerers. Anyone with the right equipment could listen. In a world divided by ideology, borders, and fear, this tiny machine brought everyone under one sky. It didn't care who was listening. It just beeped, patiently, from the void. The mission itself was simple. Sputnik didn't carry scientific instruments or cameras. It didn't take pictures or gather data. It wasn't designed to explore. Its purpose was proof. Proof that a rocket could lift an object beyond Earth's pull. Proof that something launched from a launch pad could fall into orbit instead of falling back to Earth. And most of all, proof that the Soviet Union was leading the race that hadn't even been officially declared yet. It only took 96 minutes for Sputnik to complete a full orbit. It would circle the Earth again and again over cities, over oceans, over sleeping children, and anxious leaders, transmitting its calm, unwavering signal for 3 weeks before its batteries died. Even then, the satellite remained in orbit, drifting silently for months before finally burning up as it re-entered the atmosphere in January of the following year. The impact of Sputnik rippled far beyond its modest size. In the United States, its launch triggered a national soul-searching. How had the Soviets beaten America into space? How had they reached orbit first, seemingly out of nowhere? There was outrage, disbelief, and a growing call for action. Scientists were called to testify before Congress. School curriculums were revised to emphasize math and science. The U.S. government responded by creating NASA in 1958, transforming its scattered military programs into a centralized civilian space agency. Funding poured into research. New labs were built. New minds were recruited. The race had truly begun, and the finish line wasn't Earth, it was the cosmos. But the Soviets weren't finished. Just a month after Sputnik, they launched Sputnik 2, this time carrying a passenger, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow named Laika. She became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Her journey was tragic, and her survival brief, but it was another first, another line crossed. With each new launch, the Soviets pushed the envelope, keeping the world's attention firmly fixed on the skies. And still, behind all the rivalry, behind the headlines and speeches and military briefings, something quieter was unfolding. The beeping of Sputnik had awakened a generation of dreamers. Children listened to its signal and imagined life beyond Earth. Scientists found renewed purpose. Writers and filmmakers began crafting new visions of humanity among the stars. The night sky, once distant and cold, now felt closer touched by human hands. If a sphere of metal and wires could reach orbit, what else was possible? There was also a poetic symmetry in it all. For thousands of years, humans had used the stars to navigate, to pray, to dream. Now, one of our own creations was among them, a man-made star tracing a path over ancient lands and modern cities alike. The same skies watched by farmers and pharaohs now held something new, something born of imagination and engineering, fire and ambition. And in that Bipinga sound so simple, yet so revolutionary, was the beginning of a story that would carry us farther than ever before. The space race was no longer a theoretical contest. It was real, and it had a soundtrack, a quiet, persistent signal from the darkness, announcing that the age of Earth alone was over. The sky was no longer the limit, it was only the beginning. By the time the world had grown used to the steady beeping of Sputnik, it became clear that the next step in space exploration wouldn't be just about machines. The question had shifted. It was no longer whether we could send objects into space, it was whether living beings could survive the journey. Could a heart beat in orbit? Could lungs breathe in a pressurized capsule? Could a brain endure the weightlessness, the silence, the unknown? Before humans could dare to reach for the stars, others would go in their place, creatures small and brave, chosen not by ambition, but by circumstance. And so began the era of animal pioneers, a quiet chapter of courage and sacrifice that laid the foundation for every human step to follow. In the cold November of 1957, just a month after Sputnik's historic orbit, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 2 with a passenger on board, a small, mixed-breed dog named Laika. Found wandering the streets of Moscow, Laika was selected for her calm temperament and small size. She had no idea, of course, that she would become the first living being to orbit the Earth. The capsule had no return mechanism. The mission was designed from the start to be one way. Soviet officials claimed she survived several days in space, but later accounts revealed that Laika died within hours due to overheating. Still, her journey proved that a living organism could survive launch, orbit, and at least the initial stages of space travel. Her heartbeat, her breathing, her stress responses all were monitored in real time, and her sacrifice became both a scientific milestone and a deeply human moment of reflection. She was called a hero, a martyr, a symbol, and though she could never understand the role she played, the world remembered her name. As the Soviets continued their biological missions, the Americans followed with their own. Rather than dogs, they chose primate creatures genetically closer to humans, whose reactions might better mirror what a human astronaut would experience. In 1949, a rhesus monkey named Albert II became the first monkey in space, reaching 83 miles above Earth aboard a V-2 rocket. He died upon impact due to a parachute failure. Many others followed Albert III, each mission bringing new lessons and new heartbreaks. Some survived, some didn't. One of the most famous was a chimpanzee named Ham. In 1961, just months before the first human launch, Ham was trained to perform tasks in response to light and sound during his brief flight. His capsule soared over 150 miles into space, and despite the stress and intense G-forces, Ham performed his duties successfully. He returned safely, a little shaken but alive, and became a symbol of the delicate balance between science and ethics in the quest to send humans beyond Earth. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union continued to escalate, and with each new launch, the pressure grew. Every animal that went up and came back down alive gave confidence to engineers and biologists. Every failure reminded them how much they didn't yet know, how thin the line was between success and tragedy. Capsules were modified, life support systems refined, communications improved. The biological data collected from these early flights was invaluable. It told the story of how the body responds to weightlessness, how heart rates spike during launch and settle in the stillness of orbit, how digestion, circulation, and cognition behave without gravity. Each data point brought humanity closer to climbing aboard. And then, the world watched again as the impossible became real. On April 12, 1961, from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, a rocket lifted off carrying not a dog, not a monkey, but a man. His name was Yuri Gagarin, a 27-year-old pilot with a calm smile and a steady gaze. His spacecraft, Vostok 1, was small, spherical, and untested with human life. But it soared into the sky, accelerating with thunder, shaking with power, and piercing through the atmosphere until, for the first time in history, a human was in space. Gagarin completed a single orbit of Earth, lasting just 108 minutes. He saw the planet from above its curve, its clouds, its oceans, its silence. "The Earth is blue," he radioed. A simple phrase, yet profound. No longer was the sky an abstract idea or a canvas for dreams. Now it had been touched, seen, experienced by one of us. Gagarin's flight was more than a technical victory. It was a moment of awe shared by all of humanity. Crowds cheered, flags were raised, and in living rooms around the world, people felt a quiet thrill, the realization that we, fragile and small, could escape the planet that shaped us, that we were not bound forever to the surface, that the story of life on Earth might just have another chapter waiting, written in the stars. But behind the celebration was the knowledge that Gagarin had taken a massive risk. The systems could have failed at any moment. The heat shield might not have held. The retro rockets could have misfired. The landing mechanism might have collapsed. The Soviets had even designed an ejection system to blast Gagarin from the capsule before touchdown, as the impact forces were deemed too dangerous. He landed safely, parachuting down into a field, greeted not by officials, but by astonished farmers who couldn't quite believe what had just fallen from the sky. He smiled and calmly introduced himself. "I am a Soviet citizen. I came from space." With Gagarin's success, the space race had reached a new dimension. No longer was it about machines circling silently overhead. It was now about people, real, living, breathing human beings leaving the Earth behind. The bar had been raised, the stakes higher, the possibilities wider than ever before. And yet, as the Soviets celebrated, the Americans redoubled their efforts. Plans were made, capsules tested, astronauts trained under crushing G-forces, and endless simulations. The world was now watching every launch, every delay, every failure. The skies had become a stage for one of the most extraordinary rivalries in history, and the next act was already being written. But still, none of it would have happened without those quiet pioneers, the dogs, monkeys, and chimps who soared into the unknown, not for glory or victory, but because they were chosen. Their journeys laid the path, piece by fragile piece, and high above, beyond the reach of politics and power, space itself waited in silence, opening its arms to the next traveler. In the wake of Yuri Gagarin's historic flight, the United States was jolted into urgency. The sight of a Soviet citizen circling the Earth was not just a blow to American pride, it was a direct challenge. The space race had left the theoretical stage and entered something much more tangible, something personal. The Cold War was no longer just about borders or ideology, it had moved into orbit. And now, it was America's move. Behind closed doors and beneath a sky that had suddenly become a battleground of ambition, engineers, scientists, and politicians worked feverishly to close the gap. The answer would come in the form of Project Mercury, United States' first manned space program, and the beginning of a journey that would define a generation. It began with 7 men, the Mercury 7, chosen in 1959 from a pool of over 500 military test pilots. These men would become national heroes before they ever left the ground. Their names: John Glenn, Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, Wally Schirra, Gordon Cooper, and Deke Slayton, were soon known in every household. They were symbols of courage, discipline, and American determination. The public followed their every move. Magazines published stories about their families. Children memorized their bios. These men weren't astronauts yet, they were candidates, preparing for the most dangerous job in the world. And no one, not even the engineers building their spacecraft, could say with certainty if the human body could endure the violence of a launch, the isolation of space, or the terrifying plunge of re-entry. The Mercury spacecraft was a small, conical capsule, just big enough to hold one person. There was no room to stand or stretch, barely room to move. Once strapped in, the astronaut became one with the machine, surrounded by switches, gauges, and the quiet tension of unknown risk. The capsule was perched atop a Redstone or Atlas rocket, both of which had experienced catastrophic failures during testing. Still, they pressed on. America was determined not just to catch up, but to lead. On May 5, 1961, less than a month after Gagarin's orbit, Alan Shepard became the first American in space. His flight aboard Freedom 7 was short, just over 15 minutes, and it did not complete an orbit. Instead, it followed a parabolic arc, reaching a height of 116 miles before splashing down in the Atlantic. But what mattered most wasn't the altitude or duration, it was that Shepard returned safely. He had done it. A human being had ridden an American rocket into space and come back alive. Millions watched on television. Cheers erupted in schools, factories, and homes. And even though the flight had lasted less than the time it took to eat breakfast, it reignited American confidence. Shepard's voice crackled from space, sharp and calm. "What a beautiful view," he said. And just like that, the sky seemed a little more open. Not long after Shepard's flight, Gus Grissom followed with Liberty Bell 7. His mission mirrored Shepard's in duration and trajectory, but with one dramatic twist: the hatch blew prematurely after splashdown, and the capsule quickly filled with water and sank. Grissom narrowly escaped drowning, and though questions lingered about what went wrong, he was eventually cleared of blame. The incident was a reminder that every second in space, and even after, held danger. But America's real goal was still ahead: orbital flight. It would take a more powerful rocket, the Atlas, and more precision in timing, navigation, and control. On February 20, 1962, that moment came. John Glenn, a former Marine pilot with a calm demeanor and a focused mind, climbed aboard Friendship 7. His mission: to become the first American to orbit the Earth. As the countdown reached 0 and the Atlas roared to life, Millions held their breath. The rocket climbed steadily, a pillar of fire and sound. And then, silence in space. Glenn was weightless, alone, and circling the planet at over 17,000 miles per hour. During his nearly 5-hour flight, he saw the curvature of the Earth, the soft glow of the atmosphere, and the endless night beyond. He described the sunrises, the stars, the continents sliding beneath him. "0G and I feel fine," he reported, his voice steady, his presence calm, but the mission was not without its tension. A warning light suggested that his heat shield might have come loose, threatening to burn up the capsule and Glenn himself on re-entry. Ground control instructed him to keep the retro-rocket pack attached during descent as a precaution, adding more weight and uncertainty. As the capsule plunged back through the atmosphere, flames licked at its surface. The G-forces pressed hard against him, and still he held firm. The parachutes deployed, the capsule slowed, and with a splash, he was home. A hero, a symbol, an orbit completed. America had done it. Following Glenn's success, the Mercury program continued, with more missions each building confidence, refining systems, and pushing the edge of endurance. Scott Carpenter's Aurora 7, Wally Schirra's Sigma 7, and Gordon Cooper's Faith 7, which lasted over 34 hours and completed 22 orbits, showed the world that space was no longer an impossible frontier. It was reachable, it was survivable, it was just beginning. But Mercury was never meant to be the end. It was a proof of concept, a first step. The astronauts were often little more than passengers, their controls limited, their missions short. The next phase would demand more control, more skill, longer durations, more complexity. Project Gemini was already being developed behind the scenes. Rendezvous, docking, spacewalking, these challenges would define the next stage of America's journey. But before all of that, it was Mercury that lit the path. 7 men, 7 capsules, and the courage to face the unknown. As the final Mercury capsule splashed down and the chapter closed, the space race had become something more than a competition between nations. It had become a stage for human courage, ingenuity, and resilience. The Mercury astronauts, strapped into their tiny capsules, had proven that the human body and mind could endure the violence of launch, the silence of orbit, and the fire of return. And somewhere, high above, the sky that had once seemed untouchable now held the footprints of human will. The heavens had opened, and the journey was just beginning. After the final splashdown of Project Mercury, America stood at a precipice. The first daring steps into space had been taken, but they were just that, steps. Brief, solitary voyages, more about survival than mastery. Mercury had proven that a person could orbit the Earth, withstand the punishing pressures of launch and re-entry, and return home alive. But reaching the moon, an ambition now openly declared, would demand far more than courage. It would require learning how to live and work in space, not for minutes or hours, but for days and weeks. It would demand precision flying, the ability to rendezvous with another spacecraft in orbit, to dock with it, to perform delicate maneuvers while floating hundreds of miles above the Earth. It would demand not just passengers in capsules, but pilots, navigators, engineers in orbit. This was the purpose of Project Gemini. Gemini, named after the twins of mythology, was designed for 2 astronauts, side by side, working together. And though it often sits quietly in the shadow of the more dramatic Apollo program, Gemini was the bridge that made the moon possible. Every critical skill that Apollo would depend on had to be tested, refined, and mastered during the 10 Gemini missions flown between 1965 and 1966. These missions would take human spaceflight from tentative to confident, from experimental to operational. The Gemini capsule was larger than Mercury's, but still tight. It had real controls, real autonomy. The astronauts on board were no longer passengers, they were pilots in the truest sense. Their missions were longer, their tasks more complex, but the goals were clear. Learn to fly in orbit, dock with another object, perform spacewalks, and endure the long isolation of microgravity. These weren't stunts, they were rehearsals. Every maneuver mimicked a step of the lunar journey. Every orbit, every burn, every docking was a rehearsal for history. The early Gemini missions were short and cautious. Gemini 3, flown by Gus Grissom and John Young, was a 3-orbit shakedown cruise, testing the capsule's new maneuvering thrusters and flight controls. It was also notable for a small moment of levity. Young smuggled a corned beef sandwich on board, which led to crumbs floating around the cabin and a sharp reprimand from NASA officials. But humor aside, the mission was a success, and it paved the way for the more ambitious flights that would follow. Gemini 4 saw Ed White perform the first American spacewalk, tethered to the spacecraft, wearing a bulky suit and holding a small maneuvering gun. He floated outside the capsule as the Earth rolled slowly beneath him. For over 20 minutes, White drifted in silence, the sun catching on his helmet, his hands brushing against the void. He didn't want to come back inside. "It's the saddest moment of my life," he said as he re-entered the capsule. It was a poetic moment, but it also revealed how difficult spacewalking truly was. Without gravity, every motion became exaggerated. Muscles strained, suits stiffened, and even the simplest tasks required immense effort and coordination. NASA would need to learn much more. Gemini 5 pushed endurance. Gordon Cooper and Pete Conrad spent over 8 days in orbit, longer than any mission before them, and longer than a round trip to the moon would take. Inside their small capsule, they dealt with boredom, limited food, and the psychological strain of isolation. But they endured, and their data provided critical insight into how the human body coped with prolonged weightlessness. Sleep patterns shifted, muscles weakened, hearts adapted, and slowly, NASA learned how to support the human body in space, not just for hours, but for days at a time. One of the most complex challenges was orbital rendezvous, ability to bring two spacecraft together in orbit, traveling at over 17,000 miles per hour, and dock them like ships at sea. It sounds simple on paper, but in practice, it was a dance of pure physics. Objects in orbit don't behave like objects on Earth. To catch up to something, you don't speed up, you drop to a lower orbit and let the physics do the work. To rise, you slow down. It's counterintuitive, and in the early days, it was hard. Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 performed the first successful rendezvous, flying within inches of each other in space, proving that precision flight in orbit was possible. It was a critical moment. If astronauts couldn't rendezvous, they couldn't dock, and if they couldn't dock, they couldn't land on the moon. Later missions refined this skill. Gemini 8, flown by Neil Armstrong and David Scott, achieved the first docking with an uncrewed target vehicle, but the triumph quickly turned into danger. Soon after docking, the spacecraft began to spin uncontrollably. One of the maneuvering thrusters had become stuck, and within seconds, the rotation became so violent that the astronauts began to black out. Armstrong, calm and exacting, undocked the spacecraft and used the re-entry thrusters to regain control. The mission was cut short, but it proved something crucial. Training, instinct, and calm under pressure could save lives. As Gemini flights continued, astronauts performed longer spacewalks, more complex dockings, and ever more precise maneuvers. Gemini 11 reached a record altitude of 850 miles above Earth, higher than any humans had gone since sand, demonstrated rapid rendezvous techniques that would later shorten Apollo flight times. Gemini 12, the final flight, saw Buzz Aldrin conduct a successful, productive spacewalk, using new training techniques and handholds to prevent the fatigue that had plagued earlier extravehicular activities. In the span of less than 2 years, Project Gemini had transformed human spaceflight. It taught astronauts how to live in space, how to fly in it, how to fix problems in real time. It refined the technologies and procedures that would make Apollo possible. It turned astronauts from passengers into commanders. Every moment of weightlessness, every engine burn, every flick of a switch had been building towards something greater. And through it all, something else had quietly emerged: camaraderie. The Gemini astronauts weren't just test pilots anymore. They were explorers, colleagues, brothers in arms, pushing together against the unknown. They trained together, flew together, risked their lives together. Their trust in each other, and in the engineers who designed their spacecraft, became the backbone of every mission that followed. As the Gemini program drew to a close, the goals that once seemed distant began to feel within reach. The moon was no longer an impossible dream, it was a destination. The systems were ready. The skills were sharpened. The astronauts were trained. The stage was set. In the stillness of space, beneath the shifting stars and the silent Earth, humanity had learned to move, to maneuver, to survive. And the next time rockets rose from the launch pad, they would carry not just hope or courage, they would carry the tools, the training, and the knowledge born from a quiet program of twin spacecraft and twin minds. Orbiting side by side in the shadow of the moon, they were destined to chase. It began with a promise. On May 25, 1961, just weeks after Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, President John F. Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and declared that the United States would commit itself to a goal that, at the time, seemed nearly impossible. That goal was simple in words but staggering in scale: to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth before the decade was out. At the moment he said it, America had only managed to send one astronaut into space for 15 minutes. There had been no orbital missions, no spacewalks, no experience with docking or long-term survival in microgravity. The moon was over 200 miles away, a cold and distant world that no human eye had ever seen up close. And yet, the commitment was not just as a political gesture, but as a national mission, one that would soon draw in hundreds of thousands of minds and hands from across the country. Engineers, scientists, pilots, mathematicians, builders, dreamers all working together to build the greatest machine humanity had ever imagined. The answer was Apollo, a program unlike anything before it, with goals that reached beyond the atmosphere, beyond Earth's orbit, to the lunar surface itself. It would take years to design the spacecraft that could survive such a journey, years to develop the rockets powerful enough to escape Earth's pull, years to test, train, plan, and prepare for something no one had ever done. The Apollo command module had to sustain life in the vacuum of space, endure the blazing heat of re-entry, and land precisely in the ocean. The lunar module built to descend to the moon's surface and lift off again had to be light, nimble, and perfectly reliable, all while operating in an environment with no air, no atmosphere, and 1/6 of Earth's gravity. Nothing like it had ever been built, and looming over every stage of development was a simple deadline: the end of the decade. The first real test came with Apollo 1, but what should have been a routine mission on the path toward lunar flight turned into tragedy. During a ground test on January 27, 1967, a fire broke out inside the sealed command module. Within seconds, the cabin was filled with flames. The crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were unable to escape. All three were lost. The nation mourned. NASA grieved. Investigations followed, revealing a dangerous mix of high-pressure oxygen, faulty wiring, and flammable materials. The loss was devastating, but from that sorrow came change. The command module was redesigned from the ground up. Safety systems were overhauled, communication protocols improved, and with renewed focus, the Apollo program pressed forward. Uncrewed test flights validated the new designs. Apollo 4 and Apollo 6 demonstrated the power and stability of the Saturn, the massive rocket built to lift humans to the moon. Standing over 360 feet tall and capable of producing more than 7.5 million pounds of thrust, the Saturn V was a marvel of engineering, the most powerful rocket ever built. Watching it launch was like witnessing the Earth itself try to defy gravity, and when Apollo 7 launched in October 1968 with a crew on board, the command module's new design was finally proven in orbit. It was a return not just to flight, but to confidence. The next step was audacious. Apollo 8, launched in December 1968, would carry 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anderson, not just into Earth orbit, but all the way to the moon. They would not land, but they would become the first humans to leave Earth's gravitational influence, to enter lunar orbit, and to gaze upon the far side of the moon with their own eyes. On Christmas Eve, as they circled the moon, they read from the book of Genesis and spoke to a world that was watching in hushed awe. The image they captured, Earthrise, the delicate blue marble hanging in the blackness, became one of the most iconic photographs in history. For the first time, humanity saw its home from the outside, small, fragile, and beautiful. Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 rehearsed the entire lunar landing, descending within 50 feet of the surface before returning to the command module. Every maneuver, every step, every burn was rehearsed again and again. And then, in July 1969, Apollo 11 was ready. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, 3 men, each carrying the weight of history, climbed into the command module, Columbia, and waited atop the Saturn V. The launch was flawless. The journey through space, smooth. After entering lunar orbit, Armstrong and Aldrin transferred into the lunar module, named Eagle, and began their descent. As they approached the surface, alarms rang. The onboard computer was overloaded with data. Fuel was running low. The designated landing site was strewn with boulders. Armstrong took manual control, guiding the Eagle with careful hands, searching for a safe spot. With seconds of fuel remaining, he found it. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The words echoed around the world. Hours later, on July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder and stepped onto the surface of the moon, his footprint pressed into the fine, grey dust. "That's one small step for man," he said, "one giant leap for mankind." The words were etched into history. Buzz Aldrin followed, describing the landscape as magnificent desolation. The 2 men explored for just over 2 hours, collecting samples, taking photographs, and placing instruments that would send data back to Earth long after they left. They planted the American flag. They left a plaque that read, "We came in peace for all mankind." And then, as quietly as they had arrived, they climbed back into the lunar module and prepared to leave the moon behind. The ascent was smooth. They rejoined Michael Collins in lunar orbit, docked with the command module, and began their journey home. The world waited. The re-entry was fiery, the splashdown precise. When the capsule was recovered from the Pacific Ocean, history had been made. Humans had not only visited another world, they had returned from it, alive, intact, victorious. But Apollo didn't end there. 5 more missions would land on the moon. Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and finally Apollo 17. Each mission stayed longer, traveled farther, conducted more science. Astronauts drove lunar rovers across the dust. They deployed experiments, drilled for core samples, studied craters and rock formations that told the story of the moon's ancient past. They spoke of the silence, the stillness, the sense of standing somewhere truly alien. Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, knelt in the dust before leaving and traced his daughter's initials into the surface. He knew they might remain there for thousands of years. And yet, after 1972, it was over. Budget cuts, shifting priorities, and a public that had grown used to the extraordinary brought the lunar program to an end. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were cancelled. The Saturn V rockets went unused. The moon landings, once the greatest achievement in human history, became a memory. But what a memory! Apollo had changed the world. It had pushed the limits of technology, united a nation, and shown that when humanity dares to reach beyond itself, astonishing things can happen. It proved that we are not bound by the place of our birth, that we can dream larger than the sky, that even in the vast darkness of space, we can leave behind footprints. We had aimed for the moon and we had touched it. The final footsteps faded from the surface of the moon in December of 1972, when the crew of Apollo 17 Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans completed the last manned lunar mission of the Apollo program. Cernan, the mission commander, became the last human to walk on the moon, his voice crackling over the radio as he prepared to depart. He knew what it meant. Standing in the silence of the lunar highlands, he spoke not just for himself, but for an entire generation that had watched in awe as humanity took its first, hesitant steps onto another world. But as the lunar module lifted off and traced its arc back into orbit, a quieter realization settled in. There were no more missions planned. The golden age of lunar exploration was coming to an end, not because the technology was lacking or the spirit had faded, but because the momentum had shifted. The goal had been achieved. The race had been won. And now, in a world of tightening budgets, shifting political winds, and new priorities, spaceflight was about to change course. In the years that followed, NASA entered a period of reflection and redirection. With the moon no longer the destination, the focus turned inward to low Earth orbit, to long-term missions, to studying how humans could live and work in space for extended periods of time. The dream of reaching farther was not gone, but it was being tempered by practicality. What followed was a program unlike Apollo, less flashy, but no less important, a step away from brief landings and toward continuous presence. Its name was Skylab. Launched in 1973, Skylab was America's first space station, built from a converted stage of a Saturn V rocket. It was large enough to house 3 astronauts for weeks at a time. Inside its cylindrical hull were workstations, scientific equipment, a kitchen, sleeping quarters, and even a shower first in space. But perhaps most notably, Skylab was the beginning of a new kind of mission, one focused on science, observation, and adaptation. It wasn't about reaching new worlds. It was about understanding how we fit into the one we already inhabited and how we could survive in the void beyond it. 3 crews visited Skylab between 1973 and 1974. The first mission, Skylab 2, launched just days after Skylab itself, which had suffered damage during its ascent. A meteoroid shield had torn away, taking a solar panel with it and jamming the other. The station was overheating, and without power, it would soon be unusable. In one of the most dramatic and critical repair missions in space history, astronauts Pete Conrad, Paul Weitz, and Joseph Kerwin worked tirelessly to stabilize the station. They deployed a parasol-like sunshade to cool the interior and managed to free the jammed solar panel, restoring power. Their success turned a potential disaster into a triumph, and Skylab became a functional orbiting laboratory. The missions that followed pushed the limits of endurance. Skylab 3 lasted nearly 2 months. Skylab 4, with astronauts Gerald Carr, Edward Gibson, and William Pogue, remained in space for a record-setting 84 days. During these missions, astronauts conducted hundreds of experiments on human physiology, plant growth, solar activity, and Earth observation. They captured detailed images of the Sun with a special solar observatory attached to the station, revealing phenomena never before seen. They studied how the human body adapted to weightlessness over time, observing muscle loss, bone density changes, and cardiovascular shifts. Each day was a balance of work, rest, maintenance, and adaptation. And as the missions grew longer, so did the understanding of what it meant to live in space, not just survive it. But Skylab, despite its achievements, was short-lived. It had been launched without the ability to boost its own orbit, and over time, atmospheric drag began to pull it closer to Earth. There were hopes to reboost it with a future shuttle mission, but delays in the development of the space shuttle meant Skylab was left to fall. In July 1979, it re-entered Earth's atmosphere, scattering debris across the Indian Ocean and parts of Western Australia. No one was harmed, but the end was unmistakable. America's first space station was gone, a brief but vital chapter that taught lessons no lunar mission could have provided. Meanwhile, across the world, the Soviet Union had been quietly building its own legacy in space. Even as the United States focused on lunar glory, the Soviets had begun constructing space stations of their own. The Salyut program, begun in 1971, placed a series of increasingly complex space laboratories into orbit. Unlike Skylab, which was designed for a few short visits, the Soviet stations were meant for continuous occupation. Cosmonauts lived aboard for months at a time, pushing the limits of long-duration spaceflight. They grew plants, conducted biological studies, and began to learn the subtle rhythms of life in orbit: the daily exercises, the maintenance, the psychological balance required to live in a tiny metal tube circling the Earth. Over time, these stations grew more advanced. What began as Salyut evolved into something larger, more ambitious. Mir. Launched in 1986, Mir became the first modular space station, with new components added over time, like pieces of a puzzle. It became a symbol of endurance, hosting a rotating cast of cosmonauts and astronauts for 15 years. For many in the West, it became their first glimpse into the reality of long-term space habitation. And though it began as a Soviet project, it eventually welcomed international crews, including Americans. This marked the beginning of something remarkable: cooperation. In 1975, even at the height of the Cold War, the two superpowers had reached across the void for a historic handshake in space. The Apollo-Soyuz test project brought together an American Apollo spacecraft and a Soviet Soyuz capsule. The crews docked in orbit, shared meals, exchanged gifts, and conducted joint experiments. It was a brief mission, just over 9 days, but its symbolic weight was enormous. For a moment, space ceased to be a battleground and became a meeting ground. And in the years that followed, that spirit of cooperation quietly grew. As the space shuttle began to fly, the focus shifted again. No longer would astronauts launch for quick missions and return. The dream was to build a permanent outpost in space, something bigger than Skylab, more advanced than Mir, shared by many nations. But before that dream could take shape, the world had to learn how to work together in the stars. The years after Apollo were not as dramatic. There were no new worlds reached, no footprints in alien soil, but something just as profound was unfolding. Humanity was beginning to understand that space was not just a destination, it was a domain, a place to live, to study, to cooperate, a proving ground for peace and patience. The stars still waited, yes, but now, the mission had shifted from reaching them to learning how to belong among them. As the echoes of the Apollo era faded and the world settled into the steady routines of orbit, a new chapter in space exploration was quietly unfolding. The landscape of possibility had changed. Instead of dashing to distant worlds, humanity's attention turned to building a bridge between Earth and the stars, a lasting presence above the clouds, a place not just to visit, but to inhabit. In this new era, space became not just a destination, but a workshop, a laboratory, a home. And at the heart of this transition was a remarkable invention: the space shuttle. The shuttle was a machine unlike any that had come before. Where Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo had been single-use capsules, launched atop rockets and discarded in the ocean after re-entry, the shuttle promised something more ambitious: reusability. It was part rocket, part plane, part glider, designed to launch like a spacecraft and land like an airliner. Its wings allowed it to soar back to Earth and touch down on a runway, ready to fly again. For a time, it seemed that space itself might become routine, accessible, a part of daily life. Its development took years, countless redesigns, and an unwavering belief that the future of spaceflight would belong not to single-use machines, but to vehicles that could open the door to the cosmos again and again. When Columbia lifted off on its maiden flight in April 1981, piloted by John Young and Bob Crippen, millions watched as the shuttle rose in a pillar of smoke and fire. The shuttle opened the way for larger crews, longer missions, and a cargo bay that could carry satellites, telescopes, and pieces of future space stations. The shuttle gave rise to a new breed of astronauts, not just pilots and military men, but scientists, engineers, teachers, and even politicians. With each flight, more of humanity's hopes and expertise reached into orbit. The shuttle's missions were as varied as they were ambitious. It launched and repaired satellites, placed observatories into space, and carried international payloads. It enabled the construction of the Hubble Space Telescope machine that would gaze deeper into the universe than any before, sending home breathtaking images of galaxies, nebulae, and the birth and death of stars. It ferried the components that would one day become the International Space Station, piece by intricate piece, from blueprints on Earth to living modules in orbit. But this new era was not without its dangers. On January 28, 1986, tragedy struck. The world watched in horror as Challenger broke apart just 73 seconds after liftoff. All 7 crew members were lost, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, whose presence had captured the hearts of millions of students. The cause was traced to a faulty O-ring in a solid rocket boostera, small flaw with catastrophic consequences. The shuttle fleet was grounded, investigations launched, and the world reminded once again that space, for all its promise, remains unforgiving. Yet even in tragedy, there was resolve. The shuttle returned to flight, safety protocols revised, the courage of astronauts undimmed, missions resumed, and the program continued its vital work. Years later, in 2003, a second disaster, Columbia's final flight, served as a somber echo. A piece of foam insulation, shed from the external tank during launch, struck the shuttle's wing, damaging its heat shield. On re-entry, superheated gases entered the breach, and the shuttle was lost, along with all 7 aboard. Another painful lesson, another call to reflect on the cost of exploration. Yet the journey did not end. Throughout these decades, cooperation blossomed. Where once there had been only competition, the Cold War thawed, and former rivals found themselves working side by side. Russian cosmonauts joined shuttle crews. American astronauts trained for flights aboard Soyuz capsules. Together, they built the International Space Station project that would unite not only the United States and Russia, but also Europe, Japan, and Canada. Assembly began in 1998, with modules launched and pieced together over years, sometimes in darkness, sometimes in the dazzling sunlight of low Earth orbit. Every bolt and panel, every cable and solar array represented a triumph of teamwork and persistence. The station became a place of science and discovery, a testbed for technologies that would one day take us farther. It became a symbol of peaceful cooperation, a shared home for humanity in the void. Astronauts from dozens of nations orbited together, conducting experiments on biology, physics, materials, and the limits of human endurance. They grew plants, tested medicines, and studied the effects of microgravity on the human body. They gazed down at the shifting clouds, the blue oceans, the golden deserts of Earth, a view that inspired awe and humility in equal measure. Over time, the space station became the most continuously inhabited outpost in history, circling the globe once every 90 minutes, a constant, silent companion to the life below. As the shuttle program wound down, its legacy was clear. More than a vehicle, it was a bridge, a connection between the earliest days of space exploration and a future of international partnership. The final shuttle flight, Atlantis in 2011, marked the end of an era, but not of the dream. By then, private companies were beginning to play a role, developing new spacecraft and new ways to reach orbit. The baton was being passed, and a new race was quietly taking chapeau between nations, but between visionaries, inventors, and the next generation of explorers. In this chapter, space had ceased to be a prize for one country to claim and became, at last, a place for all of humanity. Every shuttle launch, every station module, every handshake between astronauts in orbit built the foundation for what was to come. The world above the clouds had become a proving ground, not just for technology, but for cooperation, resilience, and hope. Space was no longer a frontier to conquer. It was a home to share, a laboratory for peace, and a reminder every time a bright dot sailed across the night sky that we are, in the end, all travelers together. Somewhere high above, in the quiet darkness that cradles our spinning world, the legacy of the space race lives on. It lives not only in the silent laboratories of the International Space Station or the lingering footprints in the moon's dust, but in the restless curiosity that continues to push us outward, beyond the horizon of what we know. The world that once watched with bated breath as rockets soared in black and white broadcasts now finds itself living through a new time of revival, invention, and dreams that stretch even farther than before. This is not a single race, but a multitude of journeys, powered by governments, private visionaries, and an entire planet's longing to reach beyond. The story of space today is a tapestry, woven from the threads of past achievements and new ambitions. No longer confined to superpower rivalries, the quest for the stars has become a truly global undertaking. China builds its own stations in the sky, landing rovers on the moon's far side and sending explorers to Mars. India reaches for lunar craters and the red dust of distant planets, celebrating each small triumph as a shared victory. The European Space Agency joins the chorus, collaborating on missions, sharing telescopes, and pooling the best minds of a continent. Even smaller nations send up their first satellites, eager to add their voices to the music of exploration. Yet perhaps the most surprising twist in this new era is the rise of the private spacefarer. Once, only vast nations with boundless budgets could dream of orbit and beyond. Now, the names of companies SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, Virgin Galactic Air, spoken alongside those of ancient observatories and legendary astronauts. Engineers and entrepreneurs push the boundaries, building rockets in factories bright with promise. Reusable boosters arc back to their launch pads on pillars of fire, landing as softly as birds returning to a familiar branch. Crews lift off not just for governments, but for corporations, researchers, artists, even tourists. Ordinary people, scientists, teachers, doctors float in weightlessness, gaze out at the Earth's blue curve, and discover that the border between the possible and the impossible grows thinner each year. Mars, once the unattainable dream of science fiction, becomes a destination spoken of with earnestness. Robotic scouts have mapped its dusty valleys, tasted its thin air, and searched for whispers of ancient water. Rovers trundle across red plains, drilling into rock and sending back postcards from a landscape older than memory. Probes slip into orbit around Jupiter, Saturn, and even the distant ice of Pluto. The rings of Saturn, once only imagined through telescopes, are now seen in shimmering detail. Moons that once seemed like tiny lights in the night sky, Europa, Enceladus, Titanare revealed as worlds in their own right, each hiding mysteries beneath icy shells or golden clouds. Telescopes stretch the reach of human sight deeper than ever before. The Hubble Space Telescope, perched in the silence above our atmosphere, sends back images of galaxies torn and colliding, nebulae birthing new stars, the death throes of suns. The James Webb Space Telescope takes up the mantle, peering further and deeper, capturing the first light of the universe's dawn. With each new discovery, the questions grow only more beautiful. What existed before? Are we alone? How does life begin? And where else might it thrive among the infinite stars? Back on Earth, the wonder spreads. A new generation watches launches from beaches and city rooftops, their faces lit by the glow of tablets and phones. Children dream of walking on Mars, of naming new planets, of building homes among the stars. The space industry, once hidden behind the secrecy of government programs, now opens its doors to artists, teachers, inventors, dreamers. Space camps fill with laughter and questions. Universities offer degrees in astroengineering and planetary science. In classrooms around the world, models of rockets and planets hang from ceilings, reminders that the story of space is the story of everyone. The future itself is no longer a distant fantasy, but a puzzle being built piece by piece right now. Lunar bases are planned, where astronauts will mine for water ice and build the first habitats on alien ground. Partnerships form between nations, once divided by rivalry. sharing the cost and the joy of reaching farther together. The International Space Station continues its slow, steady arc around the Earth, a symbol that even in the most uncertain times, cooperation is possible. Plans are drawn for stations circling the Moon, for missions to asteroids, for journeys that will take years, perhaps lifetimes, to complete. And as the world turns, as the stars wheel overhead, the promise of space remains as intoxicating as ever. Somewhere tonight, a child looks up and wonders where we will go next. Will we stand on Mars and gaze back at Earth's distant, pale blue light? Will we build ships that cross the void to other stars? Will we find life in a droplet of alien ocean or in the chemicals of an ancient comet? The story is not finished. The journey has just begun. In the quiet of the night, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the soft hum of a station's life support far above, the faint glow of city lights from orbit, the silent passage of a probe beyond the edge of the solar system, carrying a message in many languages. We were here, we dreamed, we built, we reached for the stars. And as you close your eyes, remember above you, in the endless night, explorers are awake, watching, wondering, writing the next lines in the story of the sleepy centuries, one orbit, one heartbeat, one dream at a time.